Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Arnold Rothstein, the man who turned the underworld into a business long before anyone else imagined it. Known for his intelligence, patience, and remarkable foresight, Rothstein believed that power was built not through noise but through strategy and influence. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. And share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Arnold Rothstein guide you into the night. He came from comfort, not hunger. Born in New York City in the early 1882s, the child of a respected, charitable businessman, he grew up around polished furniture and strict expectations. His father believed in fair dealing and steady work, believed that reputation was a kind of currency you guarded with your life. People in the neighborhood called the elder Rothstein a just man. Arnold listened to that language of duty, but the music that moved him wore a different beat. He liked numbers that danced, not numbers that sat in ledgers. He liked watching crowds tilt toward a finish line, liked the hush before the roll of the dice, liked how a small decision could tip the future. Schoolroom order never took root in him, probability did. In pool halls and back rooms, he learned the art of not showing your heartbeat. He was slight, impeccably dressed, courteous in a way that made older men talk too much around him. He took mental notes, as if he had a second brain that recorded every debt, every favor, every weakness. He learned early that gamblers went broke not from losing, but from losing control. So he practiced control. He kept his voice low. He quit while ahead. He declined drinks, or nursed one so long it became a prop rather than a habit. He lost sometimes. Of course, anyone who says otherwise is selling a miracle, but he lost like a retailer marks down stock, briefly, strategically, with an eye on the next shipment. By his late teens, he had discovered racetracks. The summer air at Saratoga, the chalkboard odds, the thin paper tickets, they were his classroom. He paid attention to trainers, paid attention to vets, paid attention to weather, because he believed that luck favored the prepared. He wasn't the loud man throwing cash at every mount. He was the quiet figure in a good suit asking 2 questions and filing the answers for later. He learned bookmaking from the inside out. He learned how to manage risk, how to balance bettors on both sides of a line, how to stay solvent when a favorite did what favorites do. Those were legal racetracks, but the craft he refined there would power ventures the law didn't bless. He graduated from tracks to rooms, private clubs just off Broadway, hidden dice games that moved locations often, card tables behind respectable doors. The rules were simple. Respect the house. Don't bring trouble. Pay what you owe. He ran some of those rooms himself before he was 30, choosing staff who looked like they belonged on a hotel payroll rather than in a police lineup. He built relationships with doormen, with elevator operators, with restaurateurs who could whisk a game from one address to another without panicking. He also learned the art of protection in a city where politics and precincts formed a lattice you had to climb. He made friends in places where favors mattered. He didn't brag about it, but people noticed that raids seemed to miss his operations more often than not. That wasn't magic. That was planning, donations, and careful conversations with the right fixers. It wasn't clean. It was how the town worked. Marriage came into his life with theater lights and curtain calls. He fell for a stage performer named Carolyn, a woman who knew how to hold a room with her poise. She liked his polish. He liked her style. Their life together looked elegant from the sidewalk. Good apartments, better clothes, dinners in rooms where the wallpaper cost more than most men's winter coats. Inside, it was complicated. He kept late hours and lived by a code that belonged to midnight. She wanted security in a world that preferred suspense. They stayed together, grew distant, found their way back, drifted again. The city had a say in every marriage, and the city claimed most of his attention. By the 1,910 seconds, he had become a name, you said softly. He wasn't a brawler. He was a financier of risk. He backed gambling houses. He bankrolled bettors. He extended credit at rates that reflected the danger of his clientele, and he expected repayment on time, every time. If a debtor stalled, he sent reminders that sounded like an accountant's letters. If those failed, other voices spoke for him. But he preferred the ledger to the billy club. That was part of his appeal to the ambitious young men who came to him for advice or a stake. They weren't looking for a street boss. They were looking for a teacher in the economics of the underground. Many later figures, some Irish, some Italian, some Jewish, would say they learned composure and structure from him. They remembered how he could sit at a table with feuding factions and persuade them to look at percentages instead of pride. This was a period when stories about fixed games floated through the city as easily as cigar smoke. There were card games whose decks seemed to learn how to favor the house. There were boxing matches where the bell rang at a moment that suited someone's wallet. There were whispers, loud ones, in some circles that Arnold knew how to arrange outcomes and collect on the difference. The most famous whisper of all was the 1919 baseball championship, when a cluster of Chicago players were accused of throwing games, and a nation felt its favorite pastime had been misled. Arnold's name surfaced in testimonies and in newspaper columns. A former champion boxer acted as a go-between in some versions. Other gamblers told tales in which Arnold financed the scheme. He publicly denied it, spoke before officials, and was never convicted of any role. Historians still argue over how much he knew and when he knew it. What's clear is that after those October nights, his reputation as a mastermind expanded, whether he earned it or simply absorbed it. Prohibition arrived in 1920 like a freight train carrying opportunities for anyone willing to take legal risks. He read the new law like a market report. If liquor couldn't be sold openly, that didn't end demand. It pushed demand into shadows where prices rose. He didn't want saloon dust on his cuffs. He wanted supply chains, logistics, shipping routes, front companies, distribution deals. He financed shipments of whiskey and champagne, arranged storage in innocuous warehouses, moved cases by truck and boat. He found partners willing to handle rougher parts of the job, and paid them fairly, not because he was sentimental, but because reliable partners protected his investment. He had partners in different neighborhoods, and made sure they had reasons to talk business instead of history. Violence still existed around the trade. This was New York. But he built systems to keep it at a distance from himself. He wasn't the man with a crate on his shoulder. He was the line item on the ledger, the backer who kept everything moving. He spread his bankroll across more than booze and cards. Real estate drew him in. Mortgages, quick-turn purchases, quiet holdings under other names. He liked rooms that looked legitimate on paper, and he liked the leverage that came with lending large sums quickly to borrowers who couldn't walk into banks. He took collateral that made sense, accepted payments on strict schedules, refinanced with terms that reminded people who held the power. To some, he was a lifeline. To others, a burden that grew heavier each week. Yet few could deny that when he promised to provide funds, the money appeared. In a world filled with fraud and empty boasts, this reliability made him indispensable and dangerous at once. He bet on sports in a way that resembled research more than gambling. He studied jockeys and trainers, read forms, spoke to insiders who traded tidbits for couriered cash. Stories spread that he nudged outcomes at tracks and ballparks. Some of those stories were surely exaggerations. Some weren't, according to investigators who tried to pin specifics on him. What can be said with confidence is that he made fortunes on events that many thought beyond influence, and that he did it without breaking his calm. Friends said he would walk around a table before a high-stakes poker game and chat with dealers about their families, then sit down and win by listening to the rhythm of breath and the cadence of bets. Enemies said he controlled rooms. He would smile politely and say he simply played better than most because he respected money the way a craftsman respects tools. He became a figure at night spots where food and information were both on the menu. At a Broadway restaurant known for its cheesecake and gossip, he had a favorite table. Columnists took note. Actors nodded as he passed. Policemen outside acknowledged him without writing his name. He enjoyed being seen when it suited him, because visibility confers a kind of safety in a town where the famous are harder to shove. Yet he could disappear for days when needed, running meetings in apartments borrowed from friends of friends, sorting disputes with a broker's patience. He settled arguments over territories, solved disagreements over shipments, and carved up percentages so that volatile men left a room nodding rather than shouting. That talent for mediation made him more than a gambler. It made him the person you called when your problem involved two other dangerous people. He also built a reputation for an ethic that looked like honor within his world. He paid debts, even when the outcome stung. He kept appointments. He refused to stiff anyone he had promised to pay, because his word, he said, was his brand. That discipline drew bright, ambitious youngsters into his orbit. Some would become household names in later decades. Men who built national organizations out of city rackets. They learned how to keep books and how to keep cool from watching him. They learned to separate business from temper. They learned that a silent man with a clean collar could outmaneuver a loud man with a weapon. They didn't learn softness. He didn't run a charity, but he did run a school in patience, leverage, and composure. Legal pressure arrived with his fame. Prosecutors eyed his clubs, his loans, his wagering. Grand juries summoned him. He appeared in neat suits and answered in measured tones. He had lawyers who knew when to object and when to smile, and judges who seemed inclined to see him as a businessman miscast by gossip. Indictments came and went. Charges fizzled. Witnesses contradicted themselves. He faced accusations of bribery and fixing, of trading in liquor before permits allowed it, of lending money at rates that turned the law's stomach. Yet the paper trail always seemed to fall short of what courts required. He didn't beat the system in dramatic confrontations. He outlasted it in drab rooms with stenographers and coffee cups cooling on windowsills. Through it all, he tried to stay ahead of change. He sensed which gangs were rising, which were peaking, which political winds were shifting. He traded with Irish crews who ran old Manhattan corners and with Italians forming new alliances downtown and in Brooklyn. He respected the talents of Jewish operators who, like him, had grown up caught between opportunity and exclusion. He refused to get trapped in ethnic trenches. Money crossed those invisible borders because he pointed it that way. The goal, in his eyes, was to keep the city's economy, its legal and illegal halves, humming in tandem, and to skim off the rhythm without drawing too much heat. For a while, it worked as if he had drawn the grid himself. People went to his rooms to lose and win. Disputes came to him to cool down. Money flowed to him and through him. He believed he could manage risk the way an engineer manages pressure, by building valves and channels and backups. But risk is alive. And New York is a river that eats its own levees. The bigger his reach, the more jealousies he inspired, the more he became the obvious target when someone else's plan went wrong. The more rumors accumulated like snow on a cornice. One bad slip and a whole structure can fall. He didn't believe in melodrama. He believed in calculation. That faith would carry him to triumphs that felt serene. It would also carry him into rooms where the cost of a misread grew lethal. For now, picture him leaving a restaurant near Times Square in a well-cut overcoat, hat brim low, winter air sharp against his cheeks, a driver waiting at the curb. He steps into the car and checks his watch. A meeting in an hour, a call to return, a game to visit, not to play, just to watch, to listen, to keep the gears oiled. He taps a cigarette against his case, then puts it away unlit. He likes clear senses. The night belongs to him, or so it seems, and the city is a vast table where he believes he knows the odds. He never rushed breakfast. Mornings were for newspapers, quiet calls, and small corrections. A phone on the table, coffee cooling, pencil tapping. He scanned the columns for tells that most readers missed. Changes in enforcement, a judge's remarks, a reporter's choice of adjectives. He read results from the tracks, and then called men who worked stables, men who managed barns, men who swept up after races, and saw which horses coughed. He didn't fling cash. He nudged numbers until they behaved. To those who worked for him, the rhythm felt like a banker's office, not a dive. That is what he built in a city convinced that nightlife meant noise. He built silence, in which money listened. By the late 1910 seconds, he controlled rooms that looked respectable on entry. A polished floor, a clerk's desk, a vase with fresh flowers, bellhop uniforms pressed to perfection. Behind that pleasant front, private doors led to felt-top tables and dice layouts with space to breathe. He hired dealers who never raised their voices and doormen who kept tempers outside. Credit slipped across tables in discreet notes. Chips were chips, but in truth, the house ran on faith that he created and guarded. He paid on time, and he collected on time, and that alone set him apart from operators who vanished when a run of luck turned against them. Reliability earned more than fear ever could. His name carried through hallways where politicians shook hands and police captains balanced precinct books. He wasn't a crusader. He was a realist who understood the city's mixed economy, licenses and bribes, permits and favors, enforcement and discretion. He met with wardmen who knew which doors to leave unopened. He met with lawyers who could translate statutes into chances and fines into costs of doing business. Among those lawyers, a gifted talker named William Fallon became essential. Fallon loved a courtroom the way actors love an audience. He could turn a vague fact into a shield and an inconsistent witness into a footnote. With counsel like that, the risk of raids became manageable rather than fatal. He watched the market for vice and saw prohibition on the horizon long before January 1920. While moralists wrote about virtue, he studied supply lines. The coastline offered anchor points where freighters could linger just beyond reach. Speedboats could cut the last miles under cover of fog. Warehouses could be rented in other names with textiles listed on deliveries. Trucks could be swapped at midpoints to confuse trackers. He arranged credit for crews who could handle cargo and for saloon keepers nimble enough to become hosts of discreet rooms. He preferred champagne and scotch because customers did. He set prices to reward loyalty and discourage betrayal. He didn't pour drinks. He orchestrated flow. He knew that any product needed distribution. He put capital behind men who understood neighborhoods, then required reports with the precision of bank statements. If a load went missing, he asked the right questions. Who loaded? Who drove? Who signed? If a rival threatened a route, he convened meetings with calm voices around a clean table, moving percentages like sliding beads on an abacus until the room cooled. When tempers flared, he cut off credit rather than burn bridges. Money is a thermostat, he liked to say, without saying it. Sports remained his classroom and his billboard. He knew gamblers who approached ballplayers with rough persuasion and gamblers who preferred smooth promises. He preferred to deal with gamblers who could keep their mouths shut. In the fall of 1919, when the baseball championship fell under suspicion, his name floated through testimony and gossip like a watermark. A former featherweight champion served as a go-between in some accounts, claiming that Arnold financed a scheme to tilt the outcome. He denied it under oath, said he liked baseball too much to break it, admitted he bet on the games as any man in his world did, and walked out without a conviction. The courts could not prove he ran that plot. The new baseball commissioner banished 8 Chicago players for life, while Arnold, in tailored suits, continued to dine at his favorite Broadway restaurants and take calls. The episode enlarged his legend far more than any verdict could have. Racetracks stayed central to his craft. Saratoga in the summer provided both leisure and data. On the clubhouse lawn, he greeted owners, trainers, vets, writers. He invested in information, not superstition. Rumors insisted he could sway a result by steering jockeys or creating fog in the betting pools. Some of that was fable spun by losers who needed reasons for losses. Some of it had roots in quiet arrangements that investigators could smell but not pin down. He liked odds that moved slowly, not crowds that surged. If a writer took his advice, it was usually because money promised future comfort, rather than a threat promised immediate harm. He preferred incentives to intimidation. His social circle widened as Broadway realized that a soft-spoken financier could stabilize nightlife. He backed clubs where the hostesses sparkled and the ice never ran out. A star like Texas Guinan could greet patrons with charm, while the book stayed straight because his clerks watched every bottle. He didn't want brawls or headlines. He wanted rooms where actors and producers, reporters and boxers, bankers and bookmakers could share tables without feeling exposed. At Lindy's, where cheesecake and gossip competed for attention, he held court without looking like a king. A wave to the owner, a nod to a columnist, a word to a young comedian, a quiet aside to a fixer. Just inside the door, information flowed in the buttered air. Ambitious youngsters hovered at the edges of those rooms. Some would become famous long after he was gone. They watched how he carried himself, how he kept promises, how he separated emotion from arithmetic. A bright-eyed Italian kid named Lucky learned that flash attracts heat, while discipline attracts capital. A small, watchful boy from the Lower East Side named Meyer absorbed the power of patience. An Irishman with smooth manners named Frank picked up how to make a meeting feel like a favor rather than a demand. They called him the Brain because he seemed to live 2 beats ahead of everyone else. He encouraged their polish and corrected their haste. When they asked about muscle, he reminded them that contracts and courtesy lasted longer than panic. Loans extended his reach across industries. He wrote checks to theater producers who needed rehearsal money and to grocers who wanted to expand. He wrote larger checks to operators who moved cases, ran card rooms, or booked fights. He demanded collateral or influence, sometimes both. If a borrower hesitated at his terms, he didn't raise his voice. He simply reminded them that banks would not see them at all, while he offered a path forward. He expected punctual installments. If a schedule slipped, he accepted apologies once. A second slip meant renegotiation at a rate that the debtor would remember. He didn't slam doors. He let them close slowly with that soft click that carried farther than a shout. Investigations trailed him like shadows. Grand juries convened to examine gambling houses, bootleg shipments, betting rings at the tracks. He walked into those rooms unhurried, hat in hand, suit pressed, and spoke in the careful phrases of someone who understood perjury better than most judges. He denied the crimes that could be proven and sidestepped the ones that could not. He often left through side doors while the reporters outside scribbled headlines about the Underworld's banker and the man who keeps Broadway oiled. Charges appeared and evaporated. A bribe case dimmed when a witness recanted. A transportation case faded when documents failed to match dates. People said he had the luck of a man who wrote his own odds. He preferred to think he had the discipline to travel light. His reputation as a mediator grew with every calm meeting that ended without cracked ribs or shattered glass. He could seat rival bosses at opposite ends of a table and, within an hour, present a formula that paid both enough to walk away. He didn't pretend harmony where none existed. He cut pie with a calculator and left egos outside. If a crew insisted on revenge, he paused the room and told a story about a gambler who chased a loss and lost his house, using the parable to save men from impulses that would cost them dearly. Not everyone listened. Enough did to keep him central. Whispers about narcotics began to drift through his orbit as the decade advanced. The profits tempted many, and rumors tied his money to early shipments. Some contemporaries insisted he financed imports. Others argued he stayed clear to avoid federal heat. Records are thin and arguments loud. He faced inquiries late in the decade that brushed against drug cases, but did not end with a conviction. What is safe to say? He liked predictable markets more than volatile ones, and liquor was easier to manage than powder at that time. If he tested those waters, he did it through layers that kept his name far from packages. Saratoga brought him into contact with lawmakers as well as bettors. Politicians vacationed there, and over clams and coffee, he built bridges that mattered in autumn when clubs reopened in Manhattan. Tammany Hall understood that order kept voters calmer than chaos. He delivered order inside his rooms, and that made him useful to men who measured seasons by election cycles. He gave to charities in his father's name, attended banquets, posed for photographs with civic boosters. The contrast pleased him. Daylight respectability, midnight precision. He never confused the halves. He simply made sure each half supported the other. At home, life with Carolyn moved in tides. She loved theater and friends. He loved control and calm. They entertained beautifully when schedules aligned, and they spent long stretches apart when they did not. She wanted him away from risk. He wanted to believe he had turned risk into a ledger entry. They argued and reconciled with the care of two people who knew both the price of pride and the cost of surrender. She trusted his intelligence more than his hours. He promised to be careful, and for a long time he was. Though he avoided street fights, he understood the need for physical security. He hired drivers who doubled as shields and paid retainers to men who could stand behind him without drawing attention. One such man, a volatile figure with a taste for danger, moved in his wake for a while, ferrying messages and sometimes leaning on slow payers. That man later chased his own headlines and made enemies too quickly. Arnold believed in resilience over bravado. Their paths diverged when the cost of that volatility exceeded the benefit. Reporters tried to trap him with compliments as much as accusations. A columnist would call him Broadway's banker, and then slide in a question about a shipment that vanished. He answered with a gentle smile and a line about how gamblers talk too much. He let others play characters. He played the man who kept appointments, settled accounts, and refused to be photographed with a glass in his hand. In an age when photographers loved images of men carousing, he preferred shots in which he looked like he might be heading to a board meeting. His patience extended to personal habits. He didn't drink to excess, didn't indulge in loud displays, didn't gamble for the thrill when the math said stop. He could sit at a table through long nights without raising his pulse, watching the flow of chips across green felt until a pattern emerged. If a dealer flicked cards with a flourish that hid something, he noticed. If a player leaned forward in a way that signaled nerves, he filed it away. He valued tells the way a botanist values leaves. He knew them all and never announced it. Money bought him access to rooms where civil servants and businessmen mixed. He never arrived uninvited. He let others request his presence and then kept the conversation useful. A contact name, a supplier with a better rate, a story that warned against a bad bet. He never embarrassed a host by talking shop while trays moved. He would step aside after dessert and, in a quiet corner, arrange the next week's logistics with a whisper and a handshake. The people he helped remembered that he solved problems without gloating. Gratitude kept doors open. He spread risk across ventures so that one raid or one rumor would not collapse his week. A percentage from a nightclub might balance a slow week at the track. A successful series of card games might offset legal fees from an inquest. A quick buy and sell in real estate could mask the cash flow from a liquor shipment. He moved money without leaving footprints. Cashier's checks through friendly banks, bills counted in offices that looked like import firms, notes that read like invoices for fabric. If a balance sheet leaked, it showed a garment company getting paid. Only insiders knew the fabric was glass bottles. Through all this, he never forgot his father's shadow. Abe the Just had built a name that meant fair dealing in the neighborhood. Arnold repurposed that legacy for a city where legality and fairness rarely matched. He made sure his words stayed good inside his sphere. He guarded that brand as fiercely as his father had. That conscious continuity mattered to him. It allowed him to believe that, though he was breaking laws, he was imposing order on disorder. By the mid-1920s, he seemed unassailable. The city's nightlife pulsed, prohibition money washed through clubs and warehouses, and he stood in the center with a cool gaze and a steady hand. He had outlived scandals that would have drowned louder men. He had made disasters in other people's lives into footnotes in his own ledger. The act of staying calm had become his signature. Yet he also knew that the higher a man sits, the more attention he attracts. And attention is a tax that never stops climbing. What he could not control were the egos of people who relied on him. Young operators he had taught sometimes mistook his patience for softness and pressed boundaries he had drawn. Rivals decided that sharing was a prelude to taking and began to test routes with hijackings pitched as misunderstandings. Politicians felt national pressure to show they were serious about the dry law and ordered visible raids. He adjusted, but each adjustment cost something: a friend, a routine, a sense of invulnerability. He still believed that the right meeting could fix the wrong week. So he set more meetings in neutral spaces, chose hotel suites with good sightlines, scheduled sessions at hours that calmed hotheads. He brought ledgers and lawyers instead of bodyguards and barkers. He remained convinced that arithmetic could disarm jealousy. For a time, it did. The night air still felt like his element. The city still sounded like his machine. But markets don't ask permission to change. And each new venture brought someone who thought a faster draw could beat a slower heartbeat. He had always said that most men ruin themselves by chasing losses, in gambling and in life. He sat on that wisdom like a stone in his pocket. He told protégés to walk away when the numbers turned ugly. He told creditors to forgive once and not twice. He told himself that his own caution would hold. As the decade edged toward its final years, pressure mounted from directions even he had not fully mapped. A bitter argument over a game that didn't feel clean, rivals eager to see the careful man stumble, a season when his name drew more envy than gratitude. The steady heartbeat stayed steady. For now, as he rode through midnight streets toward yet another appointment where numbers, tempers, and promises would need a calm hand to balance them again. Summer drifted upstate with the smooth confidence of a seasoned bettor, and he followed it to Saratoga, where lawns stayed clipped and gossip rode on the breeze. He liked the way a track concentrated a city's personality into an oval. Wealth in the boxes, hustle at the rail, knowledge in the barns. One season brought the kind of afternoon that would cling to his name for years. A colt few had favored crossed the line first, while a celebrated stable star stayed away from the gate. Rumors flew that purse strings had been pulled from a suite rather than a saddle. He had backed his judgment heavily that day, and he left with winnings that made bookmakers swallow. Trainers muttered. Writers circled. Investigators probed. Nothing stuck to the record, but the legend grew. He didn't just bet, he positioned the pieces. Whether a jockey took a suggestion or a rival scratched for private reasons, he would not say. He let the whispers carry his reputation further than any boast could. Back in Manhattan, his rooms operated like clockwork. The front desk logged guests as if the place were a small hotel. The inner rooms hummed with chips and quiet talk. Dealers kept games smooth. Cashiers noted credits and debits without drama. In an age of smoky backrooms, his houses felt ventilated, almost clinical. He believed that civility protected profit. A drunk lost control, not perspective. He preferred patrons who could count. He posted men at doors to turn away trouble before it reached felt. He gave markers to steady clients who honored promises. He cut off the ones who treated money like theater tickets. Discipline, not luck, kept the lights warm. His influence as mediator expanded in step with his bankroll. A liquor supplier complained that a truck had gone missing on a Brooklyn route. A Bronx crew blamed a misunderstanding. He convened them in a suite with fruit on the table and notepads at each place, set out the facts, and proposed a split that recognized injury without inviting revenge. The room cooled. Hands were shaken. A route reopened under revised terms. He repeated this pattern, week after week, until his number was the one people called when it all threatened to crack. He preferred balancing sheets to balancing egos, but he knew which numbers soothed which tempers. Bootlegging became a machine too complex to run on impulse. He put capital where it mattered. At the real docks, on the boats that slipped in close to shore at the right hour, in the warehouses that smelled like textiles on paper, and oak casks in truth. He financed fleets of trucks with chassis strong enough to carry crates over bad roads and engines quick enough to outrun a siren. He placed capable men in dispatch, hired clerks who filed invoices that read like fabric shipments, and paid drivers who could keep their mouths closed. When a batch tasted wrong, he replaced it without argument, because bad product cost more than good manners. He trusted the men who controlled neighborhoods to mind retail. He handled wholesale with the care of a shipping clerk who understood that each case represented 10 problems solved and 10 more avoided. He did business with figures who would later loom over national headlines. A tight-lipped kid with sharp suits learned that a banker's voice wins more allies than a brawler's howl. A Lower East Side prodigy, good with numbers and slower with temper, absorbed the idea that legal trappings are armor in a messy world. A smooth-talking Irish operator recognized the value of a handshake that bound both sides to an appointment. They picked up habits from him: pay on time, show up early, dress well, know when to stop, and they carried those habits into enterprises that outlasted prohibition. He never stood in front of them to take bows. He sat beside them and corrected their math. Rumors about narcotics brushed his name as federal agents widened their nets. Some swore he floated money into early shipments that moved through the same ports as liquor. Others insisted he avoided that line because the penalties were heavier and the margins too wild. Inquiries touched him without bringing charges he couldn't shake. The public record shows questions, subpoenas, appearances, and exits. The debates among historians continue. What he undeniably did was pick markets that rewarded organization and penalized noise. He liked predictable demand. He liked goods that didn't explode a room. In sports, he kept gambling professional. He bet on baseball, boxing, horses, and college football with a level head, sometimes laying off portions of a risk to keep exposure steady, sometimes taking a position when inside information justified it. He relished the data: weather, injuries, travel fatigue, a pitcher's temper on short rest. He respected that athletic contests had lives of their own and that even the best plan could get beaten by a moment nobody saw coming. He still believed in influence where influence was possible. A few arrangements left long shadows. Most vanished into the fog that trails any betting generation. A former champion boxer who knew him from old card rooms appeared in stories where plans to tilt the field were discussed. The boxer would tell tall tales to reporters for the price of lunch. Arnold would smile and let the fog thicken. Courtrooms punctuated his calendar. A gambling investigation convened. He appeared in a neat tie, answered carefully, and went home. A liquor case started. He retained top counsel, who cross-examined a witness into contradictions. A bribery claim surfaced. Paperwork failed to line up with dates. Indictments withered. Mistrials multiplied. Prosecutors sighed. He stayed free not because he outshouted the law, but because he respected its rules like he respected odds. He used good lawyers, avoided flamboyance that made easy copy, and kept intermediaries between himself and the scene of almost everything. Away from business, his marriage lived in a private rhythm. Carolyn expected effort to match resources. He tried. They invited friends for evenings that glowed, then retreated to separate routines. She acted, traveled, adored applause. He took calls long after midnight, read forms at breakfast, spent afternoons in rooms without windows. They quarreled quietly and made up by habit more than triumph. He knew he had built a world where devotion to calm came before devotion to comfort. She tolerated it, then resented it, then tolerated it again. Their story mirrored the city's. Beautiful on the surface, complicated underneath. His advice to protégés included a point that showed unusual foresight for men in his trade: pay taxes. After a famous ruling declared that illegal income could still be taxed, he told young operators to file honestly enough to remove one easy weapon from a prosecutor's belt. Whether he followed that advice perfectly is for accountants to argue. The lesson stands out because it reflects his creed. He wanted to turn risk into routine. He wanted to file chaos. He placed money in real estate that could stand up to scrutiny. He bought mortgages on buildings that drew steady rents. He quietly rehabbed properties and sold them on for modest profits that balanced weeks when ships sat offshore too long. He put money into legitimate businesses, a small clothing concern here, a shipping supply firm there, not to clean his name, but to diversify. He liked income that didn't require an apology. Nightlife remained his stage, even if he didn't dance. Clubs he financed learned to check coats as well as customers. Hostesses remembered names. Bartenders measured pours with care. Bouncers knew that polite words at the door cost less than rough hands inside. He wanted floors that shone and accounts that added up. A hostess with a quick wit could make headlines and keep tables filled, but the books mattered most. He called in managers on Mondays with ledgers, not stories. A room that lost its cool, lost its license to operate in his universe. He kept distance from raw muscle without pretending the city ran on tea and kind words. Men with reputations for speed and menace passed through his orbit. A pair of brothers known for driving fast and shooting faster did odd jobs early on, ferrying messages and sitting in cars outside dice games. Their taste for noise clashed with his devotion to silence. He paid them, thanked them, and moved them along when their brand of help cost more than it saved. He preferred guards who looked like chauffeurs and clerks who could make trouble disappear on paper. Lindy's remained his favorite perch. A corner table, a slice of cheesecake, a steady stream of visitors who pretended to be casual. A columnist fishing for a quote, a producer seeking backing, a bookmaker begging a short extension, a cop angling for a favor he could cash in later. He kept conversations brief and useful. He told reporters nothing they could print that would hurt him. He turned down plays whose budgets looked flimsy. He lent to bettors who could settle without drama. He listened to officers but avoided promises he couldn't keep. He left a tip that made staff smile without making them talk. The room was his bulletin board. He rarely raised his voice, but he kept standards that bordered on severity. A dealer who tried to shave the deck to skim a little for himself found that respect was a one-way street. Dismissal was swift and final. A manager who padded receipts learned that loyalty did not mean leniency. He didn't ruin men for small sins. He replaced them with men who valued paychecks that came on time. Consistency was his brand. Those who worked with him did so for years because they knew the rules weren't changing on a whim. He took stock of politics, as others took stock of inventory. He noted which judges moved to higher benches, which captains were reassigned, which editors grew stern when elections neared. He funded charities partly because it helped people, partly because photographs with community leaders made useful press clippings in a pinch. He never bought immunity. He bought time. Time to move a game before a raid. Time to shift a route before a crackdown. Time to replace a name on a lease before a subpoena landed. Lawyers remained central to his calm. William Fallon, with his courtroom showmanship and agile mind, turned cross-examination into a shield more durable than muscle. Fallon won cases others thought dead on arrival, out-talked ambitious prosecutors, and kept his client's calendar open. The two men formed a pair unlike most in the city. One thrived under lights, the other thrived in shadows. They shared a belief that words, placed correctly, could move weight that force often failed to lift. The years in the middle of the decade felt almost easy from the outside. The city glittered. Money flowed. He seemed to float above rivalries that burned other crews. Yet under the surface, pressure gathered. New entrants to the liquor trade viewed partnership as a stepping stone, not a destination. Young men with pistols treated patience as weakness. Hijackings ticked up and got explained away as accidents. A game or two felt off, with a rhythm he didn't like, dice that rolled just a little too sweet, cards that arrived with a pattern he could hear before he saw. He trusted his instincts. They had saved him often. He told himself to step back from rooms that smelled wrong, and to let others chase edges that turned out to be cliffs. He had always believed that restraint kept a gambler solvent. He told that to anyone who would listen. Stay within your edge. Let bad nights end early. Let good nights end before you tempt the gods. He filed that advice next to his other maxims. Dress like a banker. Keep your word. Choose meetings over brawls. Pay taxes enough to dull a prosecutor's hunger. He lived by those rules until situations arose that made rules look like suggestions. A debt disputed. A game whose stakes climbed beyond sense. A friend who took advantage of a friendship. Those were the kinds of variables no system can delete. Even then, he carried himself like a man who had reduced the city to a series of solvable problems. He stepped out of Lindy's in a clean overcoat, paused to let a taxi glide past a puddle, and slipped into a sedan that smelled like leather and tobacco. The driver knew the route. The night knew his pace. He had appointments on the hour. A quick check on a new backroom in the 40s. A stop to smooth terms on a Jersey warehouse. A visit to a suite where a few familiar faces planned to spend too much on cards. He told himself he would only watch, maybe stake someone short of a buy-in, and get home before sunrise. He believed his own discipline. He always had. The suite buzzed low, the way an engine hums under a polished hood, and that hum drew him in even when he promised himself he would only observe. A circle of men, cards flashing in lamplight, a sideboard with sandwiches no one touched, a runner moving around with coffee, a cursory joke to keep nerves from showing he had seen 100 such rooms. What made this one different was the guest list and the number at stake. A well-known host handled the invitations, the sort of operator who liked to be seen as a captain without being one. Old hands in the gambling world drifted in and out across a few days. Some names were familiar, some merely skilled. The game ran long, extending from afternoon into night and back again. The pot swelled to figures that belonged more in a bank ledger than on a felt table. He sat, watched, then bought in, because that was what men like him did when a room seemed to demand it. He prided himself on reading rhythm. A deck has a song if you listen. After a few hours, the song felt off. Too many hands cut a fraction early. A pause before a bet that didn't fit the board. A glance passed between two players that registered as a chord, not a random note. He tucked those impressions away while his own stacks rose and fell. By the end of a run that stretched into the next day, the figure attached to his seat stunned even seasoned observers. The number floated from mouth to mouth as the game broke. It would settle around a sum that could have built an apartment house. He gathered his coat, stood, and said something quiet that would be repeated for years. The game wasn't straight. He would not honor a bill he believed grew out of a crooked table. Refusing to pay a debt in his world wasn't a small gesture. His reputation had been built on honoring markers and collecting them with the same precision. Men who disliked him still conceded that his word was good. So when he refused, it wasn't whining, it was a verdict. The host protested, Allies murmured. Stories sprouted. None settled. He didn't take out an ad. He simply told the men who mattered that a house rule had been broken, and so the house couldn't collect. If he paid on that, he argued, every game from then on would tilt toward those who could sneak an edge and then hide behind etiquette. He chose principle and risked backlash. The days that followed feel like a slow tightening when you look back. Calls went unanswered. Messages passed through intermediaries grew curt. Men who used to smile when they saw him now smiled less. A host who wanted both prestige and payment put out feelers for a meeting to clear the air. He agreed to talk, as he always did. He trusted conversation more than confrontation. He had resolved worse with a ledger and a clock on the wall to keep moods from expanding. He picked neutral rooms, set times, invited witnesses who cooled rooms just by sitting still. He assumed that if the table in question had been engineered, cooler heads would admit the point and accept a compromise. That assumption had saved him so many times that it felt like a law of the city. Outside the poker circle, his weeks kept their usual structure, at least on the surface. The liquor trade still required money at the right points and firm hands on dispatch. Crews still filed reports. Trucks still made their runs. He still backed clubs where the best entertainment in town made the headliners look tame compared to the efficiency in the back office. He still walked into Lindy's and drew a constellation of nods. He still listened to the city like a physician with a stethoscope. Results at the racetrack still came in, and he still called the men who cleaned stalls to ask if a favorite had coughed. That balance disguised the cracks. The underworld had begun to change shape. Young men armed with cars and quick tempers considered patience obsolete. Bootlegging had matured into an industry, which meant hijackings disguised as mistakes and invoices rewritten to hide pilferage. He could still mediate most of it, but every mediation cost goodwill that never quite replenished. A group he had once bankrolled on the west side was now too proud to admit that they wanted new terms. Another group downtown, ascendant and refining its own corporate face, measured every favor for leverage. He understood those calculations because they were his own tools, returned to him in other hands. Through it all, the names tied to that marathon card game kept surfacing. A veteran gambler famed for traveling with luck, and a case of stories had drifted in to play a few sessions, according to some attendees. A well-liked impresario with an odd gait had orchestrated the seating and the timings. Others came and went across the days, as often happens in games that stretch past sense. Accounts differ on who was present at which hour, and those differences matter because they reflect the fog that cloaks any attempt to reconstruct a room ruled by money and pride. What is sure? A sum went on the books in his name, and he rejected the legitimacy of the book itself. He had spent years warning protégés against exactly this scenario. Don't chase losses. Don't raise stakes beyond your edge. Don't accept terms you can't enforce later. Now his own rulebook collided with a situation designed to test it. Paying would buy peace and shatter his code. Refusing would defend his code and invite a storm. He chose refusal, believing storms could be steered with a good map and ballast. He had steered so many, after all. He trusted his skill and the habit of others to follow his lead, because it had kept them rich. Law crossed his path again in the form of a hearing unrelated to the card room. Subpoenas appear in cycles for men like him, and he answered as he always had. Suits pressed, counsel retained, statements measured. The questions touched familiar topics: gambling houses, shipments, acquaintances whose names made reporters sit up. He deflected with the discipline of someone who had practiced the art until it felt like breathing. He had once explained to a young operator that court is a game where patience beats cleverness because the record remembers patience but exposes cleverness as tricks. That aphorism had kept him out of cells, and it was keeping him out still. Judges grumbled. Prosecutors vowed to keep digging. He thanked the stenographer on his way out. Those closest to him noticed a new habit at the edges. He counted the walk between a curb and a doorway. He looked at hunting mirrors in a parlor before sitting down in a chair. He asked drivers to circle the block before stopping anywhere that put him on display. None of this qualified as panic. It was the version of caution a man like him practices when he senses that respect is turning into resentment in pockets he can't map as neatly as business deals. He told Carolyn that there was nothing to worry about, and believed it enough to say it. He still kept dinners on the calendar, and still sent flowers when he had overpromised and missed a social call, because to stop would look like fear, and fear draws observers the way a light draws moths. His collaborators in the liquor trade continued to treat him as a banker who delivered. A crew needed cash to buy a shipload of crates from a source just off the coast. He advanced it with terms that rewarded punctuality. Another group faced renewed attention from a precinct whose captain had suddenly rediscovered zeal. He suggested closing for 2 weeks and reopening under fresh management rather than paying for peace that would expire too soon. That sort of advice saved fortunes and earned enemies simultaneously, because it meant telling proud men to step back. He knew how to deliver such counsel without pricking egos, but repetition wore thin even the best phrasing. Saratoga closed for the season, and Manhattan took all the attention again. Nights cooled, coats came out. More players asked if he would sit at new tables. He declined the ones where the host looked too eager. He agreed to watch at gatherings where the guest list promised calm. The debt from the long game remained a note in the background of every conversation. You could hear it even when it wasn't mentioned, a drumbeat under the melody. He stayed composed. He told a few trusted friends that he would meet the host who wanted settlement, somewhere neutral, with time to speak and no surprises. He even allowed that, if the other side made a convincing case that the table had been clean, he could shave the sum into something symbolic to close the matter without endorsing what he believed was wrong. He had built the city's peace on that kind of math. Rumors about narcotics continued to nip at his heels. Investigators insisted the new trade was threaded through the same corridors his money used. Some associates defended him, saying he avoided that line because it brought punishment too intense for a man who loved control. Others whispered that he had invested at arm's length. Papers scribbled. Nothing moved on a docket enough to tie him down. He limited his comments to a line he had used for years. He liked order, and he put his money where order could be maintained. In that sense, drugs were bad business. Whether he never touched it or touched it discreetly remains a matter scholars still argue over. He went on operating as if his future would be decided by liquor, cards, and rooms, not powders. The list of men he had coached grew into a force of its own. They had learned politeness from him and turned it into policy. They had learned not to confuse glamour with strength. They had learned to put systems in place that outlived fashion. When they visited, they still called him the brain. Sometimes with affection, sometimes with the impatience of pupils who think they have surpassed their mentor. He congratulated them on their new roofs, their storefronts that looked legitimate, their acquaintances in municipal offices who took meetings after lunch. He reminded them, gently, that part of being large is being harder to miss. They nodded, then went back to being large. Debt collection remained his most delicate tool. He had spent years cultivating a style that turned arguments into arithmetic. He didn't threaten. He proposed schedules. He adjusted rates for men who corrected themselves. He cut credit cleanly for men who didn't. This approach had worked because it made his presence feel like infrastructure rather than menace. Yet infrastructure fails when a big enough shock hits it. The disputed card bill didn't fit any category he had built. It was a challenge to his brand. Pay. And he cheapened the years he'd spent insisting on fairness. Refuse. And he gave opponents a theme that could rally allies who resented his calm. Near the end of a week packed with meetings, he took a short ride up 7th Avenue to a hotel that routinely welcomed people like him. The place had room for private conversations and a rhythm that allowed men in suits to walk unnoticed to elevators, then to suites where problems could be unpacked without waiters hovering. He checked the time, removed his gloves, and nodded to a desk clerk who had learned to be both friendly and forgetful. A contact said the host from the long game would drop by to talk. Another voice, more cautious, suggested delaying a day until tempers cooled. He decided to proceed. He believed in seeing people face to face. He believed that a clear sentence could drain poison from a situation if delivered in a room that felt neutral. He believed the city would honor the habits that had protected him for a decade. He still planned operations while waiting. A call came through about a shipment that had hit rough water on the way in. He told dispatch to hold trucks out of sight until the weather and the patrol pattern both broke. He jotted a note about a manager whose receipts looked too tidy across nights that hadn't been similar. A pattern that usually meant smoothing, not skill. He asked a driver if the new garage door had been installed at a warehouse out in Queens. He kept life going even while a dispute threatened to interrupt it. The men nearest to him that day later said he was absolutely at ease. Not reckless, not worried. At ease in the way a chess player becomes when an endgame he has played 100 times unfolds on the board. He assumed everyone wanted to keep earning. And earnings depend on reputation, and reputation depends on keeping rooms from exploding. He trusted in that logic so completely that it had become his shield. He had polished it over years. He carried it everywhere. He believed it would hold one more time, in one more suite, on one more calm evening in a hotel where he had taken 100 calls and given 1,000 instructions without raising his voice. The hotel breathed that early evening quiet big buildings get before the dinner rush, elevators gliding like thoughts between floors, bellmen smoothing the air with practiced smiles. He arrived without ceremony, hat brim low, coat neat, a man who still believed order could tame any quarrel. A suite had been set aside, chairs in a circle, a table with water and a silver tray, windows looking over 7th Avenue where taxis stitched the street into lines of light. He checked his watch, loosened his gloves, and told himself what he always told himself. Talk first. Fix the math. Write it down. Go home. The man who had hosted the long card session was due any minute. Others might drift in, the way they always did when money and pride needed witnesses. He didn't fear the calendar. He feared chaos. That was the difference between him and most players in his world. They chased revenge. He chased clarity. He believed that a few chosen sentences could reshape anger into numbers, the way a good bookkeeper reshapes clutter into columns. He stood by the window and glanced at the street, then at the door, then at the telephone. The city felt manageable. It had felt that way to him for years. What happened next belongs to the record as much as to memory. A meeting that should have lasted an hour broke apart in minutes. Raised voices, a door opening at the wrong time, a movement that didn't match the script. An argument shifted from words to something sharper. He was struck. Hotel staff hurried. A call went out. He stayed on his feet longer than anyone expected, stubborn as ever, then allowed help to guide him toward the elevator and out to the street where a car could carry him to care. In the confusion, names were said and unsaid, faces blurred by shock and hurry. By the time doctors leaned over him, the night had changed. Police arrived soon after and asked the first questions that always come. Who had been there? What had been said? Who did this? He did what he had done all his life when backed into a corner. He controlled the narrative. He gave no names. He told investigators he would take care of it himself, a line as much about pride as strategy. He believed that the Underworld's disputes should remain there, handled by the same rules that had governed his business. He had spent years proving that courts were a separate game. He did not plan to hand this game to them. News ran fast down Broadway. Word passed through dining rooms and theater lobbies and backstage hallways before late editions hit the stands. The city's most composed gambler had been hurt in a hotel where he often met to sort out problems. Columnists rushed to file copy. Photographers clustered outside the building, then outside the hospital. His name on a headline had always sold papers. Now, it sold more. The story was too neat to resist. The brain of Broadway caught in a sudden act of violence on the eve of the stock market's last great dance of the decade. He lay in a quiet room, attendants moving with that soft efficiency hospitals learn from long practice. Friends and business associates came and went, hushed, stunned to see the man they had treated as a stabilizing force, reduced to a patient with charts at the foot of his bed. He remained himself as long as he could measured, calm, unwilling to give the police a target even if it might have cleared his own record. A priestly kind of loyalty governed him. He had told others all his life to keep their word. He kept his even when it cost him. Investigators worked quickly because the city demanded answers. Detectives traced the path back to the long card game that had stretched over days and ended with a number big enough to be its own scandal. Reporters filled in the outlines. A well-known bookmaker with a flair for showmanship had hosted. Roving gamblers with reputations for unusual skill had joined. Sums had flown across the felt until they resembled building budgets more than wagers. He had insisted afterward that the game wasn't clean and that he would not honor a total he saw as illegitimate. That refusal had turned into a rift. The rift had led to meetings. One of those meetings had become this emergency. The police moved on obvious names first. The host was sought and then surrendered with a lawyer at his elbow, protesting innocence and insisting he had left before any harm occurred. Men who had shuffled into that marathon game were questioned. Some denied even knowing the location of the hotel meeting. Others admitted they had heard there would be a talk, but claimed they stayed away. A few swore the original game was fair, and that the refusal to pay was simple stubbornness. The truth stayed murky because the people involved were professionals at keeping stories off paper. He had built a life on keeping his composure when others lost theirs. Now that composure became a kind of myth around his bed. Nurses said he spoke softly. Visitors said he made eye contact and tried to calm them instead of asking for comfort. He told officers again that he would handle it. He refused to point, even with reporters racing to invent villains if he would not supply one. He had taught an entire generation that a man's word was the foundation of his career. He now extended that logic into an arena where most would have broken and taken the easier path. While the city watched and speculated, his enterprises went on without him. Trucks rolled or stayed put based on instructions already issued. Office clerks counted money that had been earmarked days earlier. A club manager who had learned his patience from Arnold's own manner took a deep breath and kept a room orderly despite the buzz of patrons asking for news. Protégés compared notes in hallways and made sure no one used the moment to reassign routes or skim. They had learned from him to resist impulse. Now they honored that lesson like a prayer. Reporters revisited the gallery of claims that had built his reputation. They retold the baseball scandal like a ghost story. A former featherweight champion had said this and that. Another gambler had sworn one version, then switched to another after lunch with an enterprising columnist. The commissioner of baseball had punished players. Arnold had walked free. Now, writers implied, fate had come to collect on a ledger the law had not closed. These were stories, not proof, and he had lived long enough to know the difference. He had beaten rumor by outlasting it many times. Outlasting depends on time. He died quietly 2 days after the hotel meeting, having never given the police the name they wanted. He was still relatively young by most measures, but he had packed a life into those years that felt wider than the calendar suggested. His passing sent ripples through every layer of the city. Gamblers fell silent for a night. Club owners checked locks twice. Cops shook their heads and told each other that the man who had always managed to stay above street-level trouble had finally been caught in it. Columnists wrote elegies disguised as moral lessons. An era sensed it had turned a corner. The funeral reflected the contradictions of his life. The man who had kept bad headlines at bay for so long now drew them without trying. Respectable figures attended because he had treated them fairly in daylight. Men who had never been photographed together stood on the same sidewalk because he had brokered peace between their crews. His widow, Carolyn, received condolences from actresses and accountants, teamsters and tailors. A rabbi spoke of judgment and mercy. No speech could square the circle of his days. He had made fortunes in rooms the law forbade, yet he had imposed order where disorder usually thrived. People left the cemetery knowing only that a distinct kind of intelligence had been removed from their world. Money, which had always obeyed him, suddenly showed how independent it is when its master is gone. Creditors appeared with notes. Debtors vanished with excuses. Lawyers opened files that seemed to multiply. Rumors claimed he had vast reserves hidden. Other rumors said his ledger was a labyrinth, where assets and obligations exchanged masks. Executors tried to tally. The sum of those efforts suggested that a man who had financed half of Broadway's nightlife did not leave behind the kind of simple fortune that gossip had assumed. Wealth in his world was a river, not a vault, and rivers break course when the banks give way. Police and prosecutors continued their work. The bookmaker host faced a charge in the wake of public pressure. He protested that he had no part in violence and that he had left before anything happened. Trials, continuances, postponements, these became the next chapter, with witnesses contradicting each other and juries straining to focus on facts in a story that had already hardened into legend. A roving card genius with a nickname earned at pool halls insisted the marathon game had been square and that Arnold had simply refused to pay a legitimate loss. Other players whispered that the deck had been managed. The court could not turn whispers into proof. The host would eventually walk free. The question of who had pulled the trigger would remain part of the city's unsolved chorus. For men he had mentored, the lesson of his end arrived like a stern lecture. Some decided never to sit in a game that ran longer than the Sunday. Some decided never to let personal slights grow into citywide stories. Others took from it a colder creed. Build structures that can survive even if the most careful mind is suddenly unavailable. Out of those reflexes grew organizations that began to look less like gangs and more like companies, with boards, rules, and national reach. The move from chaos to management, which he had helped start, accelerated after him. His wife faced a tangle that would exhaust anyone. Estate matters lasted years. Claims met counterclaims. She had loved a man who kept his business behind doors and had to face that business under bright lights. Friends helped where they could. She positioned herself between harsh headlines and her private grief. The city moved on around her, as cities do, but she held on to memories of the composed gentleman at dinner and the unreadable figure at midnight, two sides of a person few truly understood. As for the accusations that had gathered around his name through the decade, they would continue to be debated. His role in bootlegging remained obvious. He financed supply and distribution with a precision that kept bottles pouring and balances steady. His role in sports betting remained central. He wagered with skill, laid off risk, and sometimes leaned on influence in ways investigators could smell but not map. His role in bribery lived in the gray zones of a city where favors bought time rather than absolution. Allegations about narcotics hovered at the edges, with some contemporaries swearing he invested, and others saying he avoided that path because it lacked the order he prized. The record holds more questions than answers there. What nobody disputes is that he turned illegal markets into something that resembled legal business, imposing schedules, contracts, and expectations where none had existed. The city that had taught him everything learned something from him too. It learned that quiet can be more powerful than volume, that a ledger can settle more disputes than a club, that reputation is capital. It also learned that even the best system cannot contain every variable. He had preached restraint to his crew, as if it were scripture. He had warned them about bad rooms and bad debts. Then a bad room and a bad debt reached out and ended him. The irony never left the way people told his story. Years later, writers would use him as a model for characters who dressed well, spoke softly, and controlled the tempo of entire neighborhoods. Those fictional versions sometimes added flourish he would have laughed at, but the core rang true. He was the man who brought calculation to an arena ruled by impulse. He made a city he loved run on time, even at midnight. He kept his word when it cost him. He refused to give the state a confession even when it might have bought him a little ease. He died as he had lived, composed, stubborn, a believer in rules of his own making. For those who had sat in his rooms, the memory that lingered was smaller than headlines. It was the sight of him walking around a table before a game started, touching the back of a chair as if to test its balance, asking a dealer about his mother, reminding a host to keep the coffee hot so players stayed clear-eyed, stepping to a window to note the weather, because weather affects bettors, and bettors affect the room. He noticed things others missed. He carried that attention like a tool. He used it to keep peace and to earn fortunes. In the end, even that attention could not catch every angle. But the people who learned from him tried to keep using it, because the city always needs someone who watches the details. What the investigation could never supply was a tidy moral conclusion. That absence fits him. He had chosen a world where certainty is rare, where outcomes hinge on thin margins and human choices. He accepted that risk and turned it into a career that shaped New York. The last scene at the hotel was not a morality play. It was a collision of pride, money, and a belief that conversation can fix almost anything. Most days, that belief had been right. On that day, it wasn't. The city kept moving. The structures he helped design kept operating, often in the hands of younger men who had sat at his elbow, taken notes, and then built on his blueprint with their own ambitions. His name slipped from daily talk into history, but in rooms where deals still get made at midnight, his style survives. After the hospital lights dimmed and the newspapers declared him gone, the city tried to make the story simple. Nothing about him was ever simple. Detectives followed the path back to the card table that had stretched over days, the one he said was crooked, the one that attached a breathtaking figure to his name. The host of that game, a Broadway fixture, with a taste for headlines, turned himself in with a lawyer close by, declared outrage, and swore he had left before tempers flared. A few roving sharps, men whose lives blurred into highways and hotel rooms, admitted to having passed through the suite during the marathon session and insisted every hand was dealt square. Others claimed they had skipped the finale and had nothing to add. The police pressed. The answers slid like oil on marble. The district attorney's office did what it could. A public hungry for clarity got a clean-looking case. The host had a motive. A meeting followed. A famous man was hurt and would not accuse. That was enough to put someone in a courtroom, not enough to resolve the mystery. Proceedings dragged. Witnesses contradicted each other. Memories improved or worsened, depending on who was asking and how many cameras were outside the door. Prosecutors leaned hard on timelines. The defense prodded the gaps. When a verdict finally arrived, it freed the host. The act that ended Arnold's life moved into the permanent category that New York keeps for killings that everyone has a theory about and no one can prove. In those weeks, the press revived every chapter that had given him notoriety. Reporters pulled notes from old files, revisiting October 1919, when baseball's championship series had curdled into scandal. They reminded readers how a featherweight boxing champion named Abe Attell had once played messenger between ball players and bettors, how whispers said Arnold supplied the bankroll, how he had gone before questioning in a composed suit, denied arranging a fix, admitted betting, and left without indictment. The new commissioner of baseball had made an example of 8 Chicago players, ending their careers in a stroke. Arnold walked back to his table at Lindy's. The years had not changed the basic picture. A cloud of rumor, a lack of courtroom proof, a legend that fed on the space between. Horse racing also returned to ink. A summer at Saratoga, when money flowed toward a horse no one loved until late whispers changed minds. A day when a favorite scratched, and a long shot charged home. People closest to the barns grumbled that a purse had been influenced from a distance. He never acknowledged anything beyond the fact that he'd bet where information justified it. Racing officials took notes and launched inquiries. Nothing stuck. The track continued to open each summer. He continued to appear in a well-cut suit, shaking hands with trainers and choosing his wagers with a calm that drove tipsters mad. The version of New York he helped shape did not blink when a law changed. It reorganized. He had taken the chaos of prohibition and turned it into supply chains that ran on schedules and notes. Cash advanced at the docks, storage that looked like textiles on paper, dispatchers who called drivers by initials and routes by nicknames, intermediaries who had reason to keep things smooth. That was his skill. Treat everything like a business and teach people to prefer profit over pride. When he was removed from the map, younger men who admired him formalized those lessons into new structures. Crews that had once depended on charm and intimidation discovered meetings, committees, and rules. What would later be called national organization owed a piece of its tone to the quiet banker who had insisted that the best deals happened in rooms with windows and fresh water on the table. He left behind more questions about money than anyone expected. Rumor had painted him as a man who could wallpaper an apartment with high-denomination bills. Estate lawyers soon learned hard truths about a financier whose capital was always in motion. Claims arrived by the stack. Debts that only he could reconcile turned into rival narratives, with no single arbiter left to impose a decision. Some notes were honored because the paper trail was clean. Others were fought into stalemate. The outcome suggested a paradox. A man who had funded half of Broadway's nightlife did not die with an obvious fortune sitting idle in a safe. He had always insisted that money should work. When the man who made it work disappeared, the circuits shorted. His widow faced headlines in courtrooms, not just condolences. Carolyn had shared dinners and theater nights with someone who, after dessert, would step into a darker economy and keep it neat. Now she had to answer letters from lawyers and bankers, describing assets that were tied to obligations, companies inside companies, leases signed under names, helpful in one context and confusing in another. She endured that unraveling with public grace. Friends from the stage came to her side. Acquaintances from his circles kept a respectful distance, partly out of sympathy, partly because they understood that quiet was the last gift they could give her. Policing in New York, which he had navigated with deftness for years, took a serious look at the system he had influenced. Precinct captains who had been comfortable with discretion now weathered questions about how often a certain suite or club had been spared interruptions. Lawyers who had once basked in their reputations as courtroom showmen absorbed a new mood as reformers pressed for cleaner precincts and tighter rules. His favorite advocate, a brilliant defender with a taste for applause, continued to practice for a while and then met his own troubles later, emblematic of a city in which yesterday's swagger could become tomorrow's liability. The Underworld adjusted its manners. One of the bright young men who had learned posture from him, a boy from the Lower East Side with an eye for structure and a taste for distant horizons, used those lessons to help design a meeting of equals in later years where trouble could be assigned to committees rather than to bullets. Another protege, an Italian with impeccable suits and diplomatic instincts, took over slices of the nightlife and made them look like normal commerce to everyone but the taxman. An Irish operator, smoother than most, became the man you saw when you needed a phone call returned by a certain hour. Each had watched Arnold turn feuds into math. Each refined the trick further, building institutions that outlived prohibition and reached far beyond the blocks he walked. His name kept floating across conversations about narcotics. Federal agencies expanded their focus as the 20s ended and the 30s began. Some witnesses claimed he had put seed money into early shipments that rode the same channels as liquor. Others insisted he refused because the penalties were ruinous and the market too erratic for a man who prized order. No ironclad record has emerged. What the public filings do show is that investigations touched on that subject more than once in the later 20s. He kept distance in his words and in the paper trail. If he experimented, he did so through layers designed to vanish when examined. At racetracks, his formula had been simple and ruthless. Information is a better friend than luck. He had paid stable hands for details, treated trainers like consultants, and studied track conditions with the seriousness of a civil engineer. He preferred small shifts to big bets. The rumor mill insists he could arrange larger shifts when the stakes warranted. In a sport where fraud stories travel as fast as unproven legends, his image as a man who could make a favorite stumble became a part of racing lore without becoming a provable case file. Officials resented it. Bettors admired it. He accepted the attention as the tax on doing business his way. Baseball's scandal remained the story you could not tell without him, even if the evidence never reached a courtroom's bar. Abe Attell's interviews in later years deepened the fog. Sometimes the former champion positioned himself as a mastermind. Other times he portrayed himself as a middleman who overpromised on behalf of someone whose name he refused to use. Arnold had stood firm during the original wave. He bet, as any gambler of his class did, but he did not buy players. That was his line. People chose to believe it or not depending on their appetite for betrayal in the national pastime. Historians continue to argue, each citing affidavits and memoirs, each reading between lines that men like Arnold had written in pencil. One story from the hospital illustrates his code better than any dossier. An officer leaned close and asked the question everyone wanted answered. He looked back with steady eyes and said, in essence, that he would handle it himself. Different newspapers quoted different versions of that line, but the sense was the same. He saw law as an external system that did not govern his world. He had built a network of obligations and protections that lived by its own rules. He would not break those rules even when keeping them meant silence that hurt him. The place where he had eaten so many cakes and fielded so many whispers, Lindy's kept his table open for a while, out of respect. Regulars told new patrons about the quiet man who had shaped entire nights from that spot, who had waved waiters over with the same courtesy he used to recruit a partner, who had paid entertainers on time because talent deserves punctuality. Younger gamblers took the window seat and tried to act composed, but true composure has a weight that imitation never achieves. The room moved on, hungrier for the next rumor, but a residue of his style lingered in the way the better-dressed crowd carried themselves, more banker than brawler. His influence on language proved durable. The fix had been used long before him, but after him, it gained a new sheen less about brute force, more about planning, capital, and small shifts that nudged outcomes rather than demolished them. He didn't set out to become a term. He simply standardized habits. He turned markers into contracts, turned handshakes into timetables, turned loose alliances into pragmatic pacts. The city's mix of law, commerce, and compromise suited him, and in that mix he became a template, a criminal executive who believed that order was the only path to longevity. Connections to political machines were part of that order. Tammany Hall, which measured the city by wards and favors, understood that someone who kept nightlife quiet was an asset. He made contributions, attended dinners, stood for photographs with club presidents, and lent his quiet to daytime causes that required checks with good signatures. When reformers gained temporary momentum, he adjusted. He found new friends in different corners of the municipal map. He rarely fought a tide. He floated with it, always near the middle where decisions were made. Early in his ascent, he had surrounded himself with men who could stand between him and something messy without becoming a story themselves. Drivers who knew when to slow the car by a curb so a conversation could happen. Assistants who took notes with legible hands. guards who could pass for valets. Among those early companions was a handsome daredevil who learned to drive fast and talk faster. That man graduated from errands to bigger work in the liquor game and, in time, to his own headlines. When detectives compiled lists of people to question after Arnold's death, that driver found his name on one of them. He said he knew nothing. No case came of it. The association mattered because it showed the thread that ran from Arnold's quiet to a later era's noise. He treated taxes with a seriousness unusual for men in his line. After a famous Supreme Court ruling made it clear that illicit earnings did not escape the Revenue Service, he had told younger men to file something honest enough to defang an easy prosecution. He knew that a tax case could bring down someone the courts could not catch on liquor shipments or gambling houses. Whether his own filings would withstand an audit is a question that accountants still could argue. But he understood the strategic value of being able to produce a return when a prosecutor waived a subpoena. His last months had been filled with the kinds of adjustments a maturing market requires. More trucks on certain runs meant more chances for hijacking. He responded with better scheduling and minor reroutes rather than bravado. More raids in a particular precinct meant a short blackout followed by a quiet reopening under a new manager and a new lease. He never threw good money after bad. He whispered patience until the situation improved. That mindset, applied to fame, kept him out of headlines for long stretches. He did not seek drama. He managed it. Writers quickly converted his life into a prism for bigger stories about the city. A novelist turned him into a whispering figure who fixed the World Series, a character whose cufflinks and patient smiles hinted at invisible power. Playwrights borrowed his poise and gave it to fictional impresarios who orchestrated crime like symphonies. Later, screen versions softened or sharpened him depending on the decade's appetite. He would have understood the impulse and smiled at the inaccuracies. He had spent years letting rumor do free work for him. He would have recognized that fiction performed the same service across a longer span. Yet if you asked the people who knew him what to remember, they would not reach for novels. They would talk about a ledger's corners not curling, about a pencil sharpened just so, about a waiter thanked by name, about a debtor treated firmly but not cruelly, about a rival seated at a table and invited to share a solution instead of a threat. They would mention an apartment where the books matched, a warehouse where the locks were changed on schedule, a habit of arriving 5 minutes early. They would tell you that he built a framework for chaos, and for a long time it held. In the end, the fact that he refused to help solve his own case tells you more about him than the case itself. He believed in a system of obligations beyond statute. He trusted it more than he trusted the courts. That belief had made him rich and influential. It had solved problems that violence would have made worse. It also left an emptiness at the center of the record that no investigation could fill. The file closed without a true conclusion. The city accepted that, shrugged, and kept moving. The men who inherited his habits carried them into the next decade, through a crash on Wall Street and a change in the law that ended prohibition, through wars abroad and restructurings at home. He had wanted to be a still point in a spinning world. For a time he was. The spin outlasted him. But the quiet he taught stayed in the bones of the city long after his table at Lindy's filled with other names. Time did what it always does in New York. It hurried. The city folded his absence into its rhythm, but the crease never quite smoothed. The case remained open in spirit even after the courts were done. The host of the marathon card game faced charges, hired excellent counsel, and met a jury that could not marry rumor to proof. A famous card artist traveled through the proceedings, saying the deck had been honest. Other names surfaced and sank again, as if the facts were shy. Months after the hotel meeting, the courtroom emptied with an acquittal, and the newspapers returned to their favorite ending. Unsolved. People who had watched him at close range made a different kind of inventory. They counted the habits he had left them. Meetings in neutral places where tempers could be measured. Contracts written in plain language that left little room for regret. Loans recorded as if a bank had prepared them. Schedules that treated night work like daytime commerce. These became standards rather than novelties. That was his truest legacy, systems that steadied an unpredictable trade. The next generation adopted the tone and gave it scale. The season after his death brought two shocks in quick succession. A trial that produced more questions than answers, and a stock market drop that shook every ledger in town. He had speculated in markets as he had everywhere else, reading mood and momentum. But he did not live to see October turn into a long, dreary season. Those who did survive it lifted another line from his playbook. Diversify. Hide exposure in legitimate storefronts. Keep cash liquid. Don't get attached to a single stream. Men who had once thought of themselves as club owners or shippers began to talk like executives and planners. Their old teacher would have approved the pivot, even as he would have corrected their arithmetic. The adjustment after the crash and before repeal forced a new elegance on illegal business. Money tightened. Raids increased. Public moods grew serious. The hot club glow cooled into careful evenings where margins mattered more than spectacle. The students who had learned from him took to organizing not only their own houses but entire coalitions. They met in quiet resorts and around conference tables, deciding that a committee could dampen feuds better than a pistol. They wrote down the notion that no single man should be an absolute boss, and that disputes should pass through an agreed process. He had modeled that approach in miniature for years. Now it traveled across state lines. When Prohibition finally ended, men who had borrowed his patience moved on without blinking. Some shifted into slot machines and other amusements that could be dressed up as civic fun. Others doubled down on gambling dressed as nightlife extravagance, disguising the house's edge under stage lights and orchestras. A few carried the model to new geographies, building resorts where games were central and everything else. The music, the suits, the smiles existed to make the numbers feel like destiny. He did not invent those later chapters. He supplied the grammar they used to write them. His name continued to hover over baseball whenever the story of 1919 was retold. The patterns had not changed. A former champion spoke like a man juggling self-importance and survival. Ball players who had been banned grew old, insisting on their side of the story. He stayed fixed as the cool financier who allegedly made the gears turn, admired by some, resented by others, never convicted, always discussed. The trail in court records remains thin. The trail in anecdotes remains thick. He had once told a young bettor that the most valuable commodity in his world was plausible doubt. He left behind enough of it to furnish a library. Racing had its own memories. Saratoga regulars would recall a summer when odds turned like a weather vane and money shifted with them, leaving the track buzzing for weeks. Officials had looked into it, as officials do. They found only the usual mix of sharp positioning and rumor. He had made it his rule never to mock an investigator in public, and so he didn't. He simply kept walking the lawns, gathering nods from trainers who respected calm and cashing tickets that had been chosen with care rather than bravado. If a rider took advice now and then, that was between men who knew the cost of talk. His legal defenses had changed even before his last weeks. The courtroom star who had shepherded him through so many close calls was gone by 1927, a year before the hotel meeting. Without that voice, he still walked into hearings steady, swapping a showman's flourish for a stalwart's precision. He understood that the law's pace favors those who can endure it. He showed up, stayed polite, refused to fill pauses with words he might regret. The habit saved him often. It could not protect him from bad timing in a room with too many bruised egos. The estate story grew complicated in a way that would have amused and exasperated him. Claims collided in probate court. He had lent widely, and many of those loans lived in the space between handshake and contract. He had borrowed too, because even men who are rich on paper prefer to keep funds moving rather than sitting dull. The man whose reputation suggested inexhaustible reserves turned out to be wealthier in influence than in idle cash. Friends who expected a treasure found commitments instead. Critics who had insisted he hoarded vaults of money learned that he had been a river rather than a lake. In public memory, he was both a villain and a stabilizer, which sounds like a contradiction until you consider the era. Dry laws had created a market that the code of the city insisted on filling. He found a way to fill it without letting it explode every week. He bribed. He booked. He financed shipments that hid in harmless crates. He ran card rooms under etiquette, rules strict enough to make danger look like a misunderstanding. He did not claim virtue. He claimed order. People who lived through those years often separated the two because the law and the city had parted for a while and stayed that way until repeal stitched them back together. The narcotics question never quite left his story. Federal files sprouted in the late 20s with language about import routes and the shadowy money behind them. Some narrators of that world swear he sampled those profits. Others insist he called them bad business, too hard to control and too likely to bring national attention. The documents that survive point, circle, and disperse. No conviction traces to his name on that front. Scholars still debate. The safest phrasing is that a man who prized predictability preferred trades he could schedule, and narcotics, at that moment, resisted schedules. His way with sports betting regarded information as currency. He paid for it like any other goods, kept a network of informants in stadiums and training rooms, and hedged when a line moved too fast. He did not despise luck. He distrusted it. He would take an edge of a few percentage points and grind it over time, rather than chase a moment of glory that could turn into a defeat that took months to fix. That habit made him appear cautious to men who loved spectacle. It made him rich enough to influence rooms without banging his fist. His social style survived him. Night spots learned that politeness at the door cost less than repair work after a brawl. Hosts understood that keeping patrons seen but not exposed creates a glow that can be monetized. Managers learned to count as if their jobs depended on it, because they did. Even the waiters in better places adjusted, memorizing not just favorites but patterns that hinted at larger truths. Who expected privacy, who came to be noticed, who would be good for a marker, and who should be given a short pour and a gentle exit. He had trained them by example, not lecture. The police also took a kind of lesson. The old model of random raids and winks grew less effective when operators adopted his methods. If the city wanted to look serious, it had to be serious, not theatrical. Some precincts tried, others kept the old rhythm. Reformers pushed, machines resisted, public sentiment yo-yoed. Through it all, the idea that crime could be managed like business rather than a street brawl became part of official thinking even among those who fought it. You cannot control what you do not understand, and he had forced them to understand. He would have smiled at the way writers and filmmakers softened or sharpened him depending on what decade they were serving. Some turned him into a symbol of a corrupt age that got the comeuppance it deserved. Others made him the cool brain who saw further than his peers and paid for it because foresight cannot outrun fate forever. The caricatures borrowed his wardrobe and his silence. The better portraits borrowed his arithmetic, the sense that most days can be improved by structure, and that most disasters begin when pride beats math. Carolyn carried the public part of their story with poise. She faced audiences that wanted a parable and gave them grace instead, neither condemning nor rewriting a life that had been both controversial and precise. She navigated the tangle of property and claims as best she could, discovering as everyone did that his holdings had been built for movement, not inheritance. Friends kept a respectful distance from the legal maze. The city's gossip pages moved on. Grief does not. If you look at the list of men who succeeded after him, Italians with a gift for organization, Jews with a gift for accounts, Irishmen with a gift for bridges between worlds, you see his fingerprints on their posture. They dressed like professionals, spoke like negotiators, wrote down agreements, created committees, and treated territory like a pie that could be cut rather than a prize to be smashed. When they met to draft rules for an industry that technically did not exist, his voice echoed in the choice to avoid top-down monarchies in favor of balanced councils. He had survived as long as he did because no one could point to a crown on his head. He taught them to live that way too. What remains clearest, years after the hotel and the unanswered questions, is how fully he believed in a code. He operated outside the law, and yet within a system he prized. He expected punctuality and delivered it. He demanded fairness in a field that often mocked the word, and enforced it with the tools at hand. Credit lines closed, tables dismantled, partnerships dissolved with a precision that seemed cold, until you realized it prevented collapse. He looked for the narrow path between chaos and complacency, and walked it longer than most. The last part of his life taught a harsh coda to his own advice. He had told men to avoid rooms that felt wrong, to leave when the rhythm of a game turned sour, to distrust the sudden spike that makes everyone lean in. He sensed all of that at the marathon table, and acted by refusing to pay a bill he judged unearned. His stance defended the very standard that had made him a byword for reliability. The cost was the meeting that followed. He did not bend then either. In that sense, he remained himself to the last breath he took. Walk past the hotel today, and you will see a different decade reflected in the glass, but the address still carries a murmur if you know the old map. Broadway glitters differently. The racetrack still draws summer crowds. The ballparks still relive that scandal every time a new team surprises the odds. Quiet operators still prefer to be called businessmen rather than bosses. And in certain rooms, when people open a ledger and try to solve a problem with percentages instead of threats, they are following a trail he blazed without needing to drop his name. He once said to a young lender who was too eager to be feared, "Be the person people are glad to owe and frightened to disappoint." That line captures him better than headlines do. He weaponized punctuality. He monetized courtesy. He turned illegal work into a set of office habits that could be copied. He broke laws. He imposed order. He kept tallies. He went home late. His world judged him both necessary and dangerous. The city judged him unforgettable. The file on his final night stays open in conversation precisely because the man fit his environment so well that removing him could not remove the feelings that made him possible. There was no epiphany waiting at the end of his story. No dramatic confession to wrap up the case in a bow. The lesson is quieter. A person with discipline can bend even unruly markets toward routine for a long time. But routine is not a guarantee. It is a balance maintained by attention. He maintained it until the night attention wasn't enough. The people who learned from him kept the attention alive, spread it over broader maps, and gave their world a shape that, for better and worse, felt organized. In that shape, you can still hear his influence whenever midnight feels like an office, and a handshake seems as binding as a contract. Decades passed, yet the echo of that quiet figure still moved through the city like a low current. The file on the hotel remained thin where the public wanted it thick. He had walked into the Park Central on 7th Avenue believing a conversation could tame heat, and he left it for the polyclinic with the same belief intact, refusing to trade names for relief. Detectives asked again and again. He replied with a steady line about handling it himself. Some papers printed a wry paraphrase. Others quoted him as if he were giving a final lecture on his code. However phrased, the meaning stayed the same. He would not let the state write the ending to a story he had spent years writing in a different alphabet. That refusal shaped the history that followed. A bookmaker with a flair for attention stood trial and walked free because the record could not carry the weight gossip piled on it. A traveling card savant swore the marathon game had been fair. Other players disagreed in whispers they kept off the stand. The act remained unsolved, a knot tied so tightly by silence that it would never loosen. The city adjusted, the way it always does. But in the corners where money and reputation decide outcomes, people repeated the last chapter like a parable. Even the calmest man cannot control a room if other people arrive looking for theater rather than settlement. His effect on New York outlasted his body with ease. He had treated illegal trades like industries and had taught others to do the same. When the market broke in 1929, the operators who had studied him survived by moving like businessmen rather than raiders. They shifted capital, cut exposure, kept ledgers that could face daylight if they had to. When the Seabury investigations brought new scrutiny to city offices in the early 30s, men he had trained already knew how to speak in ways that sounded like commerce, not confession. The terrain changed. The habits he had planted kept paying dividends. Prohibition ended in 1933, and the ground under an entire economy rolled. Many who had made fortunes in liquor stepped into other lines without losing rhythm. Some turned to casinos dressed as resorts, where guests could pretend they were on holiday while the house collected its steady percentage. Others moved into service businesses that acted as fronts, letting them keep their networks warm while the law figured out what to do with the vacuum a repealed amendment leaves behind. The template had been his. Treat every venture as a system, staff it with people who understand schedules, solve feuds with math, keep the product clean, keep the room calm. The larger underworld settled into a framework that echoed his voice. Meetings happened in quiet retreats, where rivals agreed that arguments would be handled by process rather than chaos. That adjustment did not arrive from nowhere. It grew from a decade of watching him cool disputes by proposing splits that balanced pride and profit. The men who led the next wave, an Italian who thought like a diplomat, a number genius from the Lower East Side, an Irish broker who made calls that stuck, had all walked through his rooms and learned the difference between appearance and authority. They built structures in which a single outburst could be absorbed without toppling the whole enterprise. He had never sought a throne. They engineered a world without a throne. Baseball could not escape him in memory. Every retelling of 1919 used his name as an axis, even though the court transcripts left him outside the circle of formal guilt. Abe Attell shifted his story in interviews over the years, sometimes presenting himself as a central engine, sometimes as a messenger who borrowed a larger man's reputation to buy influence. Players once banned for life remained symbols of a broken promise. He stayed a symbol of something else, the financier whose money and planning supposedly made the machinery hum. Historians sifted affidavits, tossed out contradictions, and kept debate alive. He had lived off ambiguity, and that quality followed him beyond the last headline. Racetracks carried gentler memories that still spoke to his method. Saratoga regulars remembered a summer when odds rolled oddly, and a result pointed at an invisible hand. They argued on lawns and in box seats about whether he had nudged a decision or merely read the weather better than anyone else. Racing offices opened files, interviewed stable boys, looked at scratch sheets, and closed the files with findings that satisfied no one and angered the faithful. He returned each season to the same fence rails, smiling, nodding, treating information as currency and keeping his voice low. He never met a jury as a convicted man. Arrests and subpoenas had dotted his career like mile markers. None turned into a sentence. A brilliant trial lawyer, Bill Fallon, had done much of the heavy lifting until his own life fell apart in 1927. Even after Fallon's decline, Arnold faced questions with composure, testimony tidy enough to avoid perjury traps, presence mild enough to disarm sharp examination. He treated courtrooms as rooms with rules, no different from a club or a track. He understood that patience beats flair when transcripts exist, and he refused to give prosecutors the kind of copy that excites headlines more than it sustains cases. The narcotics debate hovered around his biography like distant thunder. Federal attention to that market grew in the late 20s, and informants kept floating his name. Some swore he seeded early shipments that moved alongside crates of whiskey. Others, who knew his taste for predictable supply, said he avoided powder because it brought federal heat and unstable partners. The paper trail never delivered a clean answer. What remains safest to say is that he preferred trades he could schedule and price, and that period's drug business resisted both. There were other gray areas where his touch was felt. Bribery, which the city treated as a cousin of taxation during certain seasons, moved in discreet envelopes and favored those who trusted routine over impulse. He made contributions to ward leaders and charities in ways that made raids predictable rather than dramatic. He cultivated police captains the way a shipping magnate cultivates harbor masters, with respect, with steady attention, and with a sense of mutual benefit. Reformers later used his era as the example of what needed fixing. Even they admitted that during the worst of the dry law, his kind of order prevented a constant riot. Money at the end did not behave like myth. Executors discovered the truth of a life lived in motion. He had lent sums that only he could reconcile to the penny. And without him, disputes became battles of memory. He had borrowed totals that made sense within flowcharts he carried in his head. The estate produced fewer clean assets than storybooks promised. Properties existed, but often with entanglements. Notes could be honored or challenged depending on how many witnesses survived and how legible a signature remained after time. Carolyn faced hearings, filings, and endless small shocks that visit anyone who inherits a labyrinth. She endured it with the same poise she brought to a room, but poise does not simplify numbers. Culturally, he became a reference point. A novelist used his posture to sketch a character whose cufflinks sparkled while rumors swirled about a fixed World Series. Later television and film placed versions of him in tailored suits, speaking softly in rooms where chaos waited outside. Those portraits bent details to fit the needs of story, yet they preserved a core truth. He represented the idea that a cool intelligence can run hot markets with a lighter hand than a gun. He would have smiled at the theatrical liberties and corrected the math where it got sloppy. It is easy to stop at glamour and forget the small routines that made it possible. He arrived early. He kept appointments. He checked leases. He read horse sheets. He called men who swept stables because stable workers see what owners miss. He paid entertainers when they finished a night's work. He changed warehouse locks on schedule. He disciplined staff without drama and replaced anyone who treated his rooms as places to skim. He expected credit to be honored like a promise, and he honored it himself until a decision violated his standard of fairness. That last stand over a crooked game fit the contour of his life, even as it ended it. He did shape crimes that mattered. He bankrolled gambling houses that stayed open because they were run with discipline. He financed bootleg shipments that turned a national ban into a municipal economy. He bribed officials to buy time and predictability for ventures that the law forbade. He bet on sports with a strategy that included influence when opportunities arose, though much of that influence remains a matter of argument rather than court-tested fact. He arbitrated disputes that might otherwise have exploded. He taught loan sharking the manners of a bank. He turned vice into a spreadsheet and enforced it with reputation, not spectacle. For all that, he did not preach romance. He told younger men that ego ruins more careers than failure, that alcohol ruins more judgment than enemies, that the biggest difference between a winner and a loser is who knows when to walk away. He preferred rooms where men spoke at a table and left through the front door. He discouraged acts that made headlines, because headlines attract reforms, and reforms attract investigators who don't accept envelopes. Some listened. Some treated his caution as a phase they could skip. The ones who listened tended to survive long enough to retire rich and unphotographed. What his death underscored is the limit of any private code. He had built an architecture of trust in a world defined by broken laws, and he believed that architecture could stand through any weather. Most days, he was right. The night at the Park Central proved that a carefully drawn map cannot prevent a collision if another driver ignores the lines. He refused to call in an external referee. He remained true to his creed even when it took the one tool that might have given the court system a clear shot at the truth. That loyalty, admired by some and scorned by others, is why the case still lives as a question rather than an answer. He lies in a Queens cemetery that has seen many New York stories come to rest. The crowd that accompanied him there included showpeople, bookmakers, businessmen, officers, and ordinary citizens who admired discipline when they saw it. The speeches tried to find a neat thread and failed, because the city does not reward neatness in such matters. His life touched too many spheres to be summed up by moral arithmetic. He had given illegal trades form, and given legal trades a mirror in which to see their own compromises. He had been both a breaker of statutes and a keeper of promises. He had been a stabilizer and a source of temptation. That duality fed the myth. Look for him now, and you will not find a statue. You will find small practices that trace back to him in places that prefer not to publish last names. A club that treats guests like clients. A bookmaker who keeps immaculate records. A dispute settled with a calculator rather than noise. A backer who can lend in the afternoon and be repaid on the dot a week later because both sides prefer routine to drama. Each is a quiet monument shaped by his view that, in a city that runs on friction, the person who reduces friction earns more than the person who creates it. His story's conclusion sits somewhere between cautionary tale and user manual. Take the parts about discipline, kindness to staff, honest schedules, and a refusal to be baited by pride. Leave the parts about believing that a private code can outlast every variable. He proved a truth that remains useful. Even in a gray economy, clarity is a competitive advantage. He proved a warning that remains relevant. Structure without humility invites the one event you cannot price. He did not claim to be a hero. He claimed to be effective. He was, until the hour when effectiveness met ego across a card table and a hotel corridor. There is a way to picture him that honors accuracy. He is at Lindy's again, a slice of cheesecake cooling, a phone near his hand, visitors approaching in a line that looks accidental but isn't. He answers a question with a sentence that contains no extra words. He moves money so a delivery makes dawn. He tells a borrower to pay on Tuesday because Wednesday will be too late. He waves at a columnist and shares nothing useful. He notices a clever dealer's unnecessary flourish and makes a note to reassign him before the habit turns into a problem. He leaves a tip that is generous enough to be remembered and ordinary enough to be ignored. He steps outside and pauses at the curb to scan the street the way he scans a balance sheet. Then he moves on. Not because the night is young, but because the night is work. You can set down the clippings now and still hear his method in the way certain corners of the city breathe after dark. The law shifted, the players changed, the industries evolved, and yet the idea he insisted on remains in practice. Treat the forbidden as if it were merely complex, and complexity will forgive you more than chaos will. He taught that to people who became household names and to people who never wanted their names uttered in public. He built a school without classrooms and a curriculum without books. His final exam came in a hotel on 7th Avenue. The grade belongs to history, which is to say to us, because history in this city is mostly the memory of how work gets done. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Arnold Rothstein here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through strategy, influence, and the early foundations of power. If this story helped you unwind or drift into sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.